Dawn breaks over the endless sands of the Libyan desert. The wind is still, the sky pale gold. A British artillery crew crouches beside their gun, its metal dull, its wheels caked with dust from weeks of movement. They've been awake all night, waiting. Somewhere beyond the dunes, German armor is rolling forward. The order comes, battery, stand by. A single gun barrel rises. It's not new. In fact, its design traces back more than 20 years to the trenches of the First World War. Many once called it obsolete. Yet here, in the heat of 1942, it's about to prove otherwise. The shell slams home. The breech locks. The gun captain steadies his voice. Fire. A crack splits the silence, a thunderclap that echoes across the desert. Seconds later, the horizon blooms with fire. Then another shot, and another. Each shell lands with uncanny precision. The men glance at one another, not in surprise, but in quiet pride. This was supposed to be a relic of the past. Instead, it became Britain's most accurate weapon of the Second World War. The First World War had left Britain exhausted, in spirit, in money, and in steel. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the nation's armies returned home carrying not victory banners, but mountains of debt and warehouses filled with the machinery of an older age. Among them stood the 18-pounder field gun, the pride of the Royal Artillery during the Great War. It had fired millions of shells across the mud of the Somme and Passchendaele, defining what artillery meant in industrial warfare. But when peace came, Britain no longer wanted to think about war. The government slashed military budgets, factories closed, and designs that might have led to new weapons were quietly shelved. Make do with what we have became the silent policy of the 1920s. The once mighty 18-pounder, along with the 5-inch howitzer, were stored away in depots, relics of a nightmare no one wished to relive. Yet history does not allow such luxuries for long. As the 1930s dawned, Europe's calm began to tremble again. Across the Channel, Germany rearmed with astonishing speed. Tanks, aircraft, and new doctrines of blitzkrieg rolled from Nazi workshops. France poured concrete into its Maginot Line. And in Britain, under the shadow of political hesitation, the War Office realized its field guns were dangerously out of date. The 18-pounder had served heroically in 1914, but by 1939 it lacked the range, power, and precision demanded by modern warfare. Mechanized forces needed something that could move fast, fire faster, and strike with mathematical accuracy. Yet, there was no time, nor money, to design a completely new weapon from scratch. So British engineers turned to what they already had. They looked again at those old WWI blueprints, the worn barrels and rusting breech blocks. There, among the relics of a bygone war, they found their solution. By merging the best qualities of the 18-pounder and the 5-inch howitzer, a new concept began to emerge. A gun with the speed of one and the power of the other. It was not a revolution. It was evolution born from necessity. Work began quietly in Woolwich Arsenal and other Royal Ordnance factories. Engineers faced endless debates over carriage design, shell weight, recoil control, and elevation. Every improvement had to fit within the limits of existing production lines. Britain could not afford a total overhaul. Still, the dream persisted. A single field gun that could both fire directly at enemy positions and lob shells indirectly with high-angle precision. It would become known simply as the 25-pounder, named for the weight of its shell. A weapon forged not by ambition, but by survival. And as storm clouds gathered again over Europe, the forgotten veterans of the Great War, those who had once served the old guns, would soon find themselves teaching a new generation how to master a machine that, though rooted in the past, was destined to shape the future of war. By 1938, Britain's rearmament program was running on borrowed time. The shadow of war grew longer each month, yet the Army's artillery remained a patchwork of modified relics. Many of the old 18-pounders had been hastily converted to fit pneumatic tires for motor transport, but they were never designed for the high-speed warfare that loomed ahead. Inside the War Office, the debate was relentless. Build new guns or keep upgrading the old ones? The answer, as so often in British wartime engineering, was a bit of both. The solution, the Ordnance QF 25-pounder, was designed around practical compromise. It would fire a 25-pound shell, but the first batches would use recycled 18-pounder carriages. The breech mechanism, recoil system, and sights were all improved, yet every change had to be compatible with what already existed in British depots. The result was a weapon that looked deceptively familiar, like an 18-pounder reborn, but performed far beyond its lineage. In early trials, the 25-pounder astonished observers. It could fire up to 8 rounds per minute, each shell traveling over 13,000 yards. Its accuracy was unmatched for a gun of its class, thanks to a brilliantly balanced combination of range tables, finely machined optics, and the steadiness of its new Mark II carriage. But the most remarkable thing was its feel. British gunners said it handled like a sports car, smooth and responsive. Its quick-firing breech allowed for a rhythm that felt almost mechanical, a harmony between man and metal. Still, the gun entered service under a cloud of uncertainty. When war broke out in September 1939, only a fraction of the British Expeditionary Force in France had received the new weapon. Many still dragged their ancient 18-pounders into battle, fighting with the same designs their fathers had used in 1916. When the Blitzkrieg swept across Europe in 1940, British artillery was outgunned and outmaneuvered. The evacuation at Dunkirk left most of those old guns abandoned on French soil. But in that disaster lay the seed of transformation. Back in Britain, as the island prepared for invasion, the 25-pounder suddenly became the center of attention. Production ramped up across the Midlands and Scotland. Engineers refined its carriage, improved the rangefinder, and introduced the calibrating sight, an innovation that allowed British gunners to lay their guns with deadly precision, even under chaotic battlefield conditions. The new weapon became more than just artillery. It was morale, proof that Britain could still innovate under fire. By 1941, the Royal Artillery was fully re-equipped. Convoys shipped hundreds of 25-pounders to North Africa, the Middle East, and later to Burma. And with each shipment, British commanders knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. A field gun, descended from the trenches of the First World War, was about to dominate the deserts, forests, and hedgerows of the Second. The age of the 25-pounder had begun, and soon its reputation for accuracy would echo across every front line of the British Empire. For the soldiers who manned it, the 25-pounder was more than just a gun. It was a living companion. Every crew gave their piece a name, a personality, and a rhythm. They spoke to it, cursed at it, and relied on it in ways only those who've heard incoming shells can truly understand. Most British gunners were not professionals when the war began. They were school teachers, farmers, miners, citizens who had learned the mathematics of death under desert suns or in the rain-soaked fields of France. But under the discipline of the Royal Artillery, they transformed. Every movement around the gun became instinct. Each man had a precise role. The layer aimed. The loader slammed the shell home. The fuse setter adjusted for distance and charge, and the commander gave the fire order. When it worked perfectly, the sequence was poetry in motion. 7 men moving as one, the recoil sliding, the spent shell flying out, and another round already on its way. Their accuracy wasn't born of advanced computers or electronics. It was born of training and trust. British gunners were trained to plot every shot through mental arithmetic, map grids, and the calm repetition of drills. They didn't just fire, they calculated. One Royal Artillery veteran described it simply. We weren't just pulling a trigger. We were solving a puzzle, every time. The gun itself reinforced that discipline. Its recoil system allowed the barrel to return to perfect alignment after each shot, meaning that once the target was set, the crew could keep firing without re-aiming. That stability gave them a confidence no other weapon offered. In North Africa, the gun crews learned the hard way how crucial that trust was. The desert was merciless. Sandstorms blinded optics, dust jammed mechanisms, and the heat warped metal. Yet the 25-pounder endured. Crews discovered they could tow it fast behind trucks, swing it into position, and open fire within minutes. Tactically, that changed everything. Where German artillery often relied on preset positions, the British 25-pounders could shift rapidly, hitting, moving, and hitting again before the enemy could respond. The gunners became a kind of mobile orchestra of fire, laying down bombardments that were not just powerful, but precise. And that precision saved lives. Infantrymen trusted the 25-pounder barrages more than any other weapon. They knew that when those shells came down, they would fall exactly where intended, often just a few dozen yards ahead of friendly troops. In the chaos of battle, that kind of faith was rare. The 25-pounder made soldiers feel protected, not just armed. It was the invisible wall that stood between them and the advancing enemy. And for the men who fired it, every clean hit, every smoke burst on target, was a reminder that skill and discipline could outmatch fear and chaos. But behind that mastery lay something deeper: the design itself, the quiet brilliance of engineers who turned a relic into a masterpiece. To understand why the 25-pounder became Britain's most accurate weapon of the Second World War, one must look beneath its sand-blasted exterior, into the mind of the engineers who refused to accept that old meant obsolete. The gun's DNA traced back to the Ordnance QF 18-pounder, but nearly every critical feature had been reimagined. At its core was a new hydro-pneumatic recoil system, allowing the barrel to slide backwards smoothly and return to firing position without disturbing its aim. In artillery terms, that meant consistency. The difference between a shell landing 50 yards off target and one landing precisely where intended. The new Mark IIA carriage gave the WWI 25-pounder its distinctive look and stability. Its circular firing platform, a simple steel plate under the trail, was one of its greatest innovations. By rotating the gun on that platform, crews could shift direction by several degrees in seconds, something no World War I gun could do. In mobile warfare, that agility made it lethal. The breech was another masterpiece of British engineering, the semi-automatic vertical sliding block design. After every shot, it ejected the spent casing automatically and reset itself for the next round. This allowed the crew to maintain a rate of fire unmatched by most enemy guns, up to 8 rounds per minute sustained, 12 in emergencies. Then came the ammunition. Each shell was crafted with extraordinary precision, its propellant charge divided into separate bags that could be adjusted for range. Crews could vary the charge depending on the target's distance, firing anything from high explosive to armor-piercing to smoke shells. The 25-pounder wasn't just one weapon. It was many, depending on what the battle required. But the true secret to its accuracy wasn't just mechanical. It was mathematical. The British artillery system, refined through the interwar years, revolved around centralized fire control. Range tables were meticulously calculated using thousands of test firings. Meteorological data, wind speed, air density, humidity, was factored into every shot. Gunners learned to apply these corrections almost instinctively. This fusion of human precision and mechanical reliability lay the essence of British artillery doctrine. The Germans feared the EBO weapon not because it was loud, but because it was predictable. Once the British opened fire, they could hold a barrage line like a ruler drawn across the map. German troops nicknamed the shell bursts clockwork thunder, an eerie testament to the gun's consistency. Comparatively, the 25-pounder didn't throw the heaviest shell or reach the farthest distance. German 10.5 cm LEFH-18s and American 105 mm howitzers could outrange it slightly. But what they couldn't match was its balance. The perfect compromise between weight, speed, power, and precision. It was light enough to be towed by a simple truck, yet powerful enough to shatter fortified positions. It was simple enough for young recruits to learn, yet sophisticated enough to satisfy the most experienced gunner. By 1942, British engineers had done the impossible. They had turned an evolutionary redesign into a battlefield revolution. The weapon's next test would not be in theory or trial, but in fire, and its true potential would be revealed in the sands of North Africa, where accuracy would decide survival itself. October 23, 1942. The desert of El Alamein lay silent beneath a moonless sky. Then, at precisely 21:40 hours, the night erupted. Across a front stretching 40 miles, more than 800 British 25-pounders fired in unison. The sound was like the tearing of the earth itself, a continuous roar that rolled through the dunes and shook the bones of every man within miles. The first round was the signal, the opening of Operation Lightfoot, the assault that would decide the fate of North Africa. Each gun fired on pre-calculated bearings, guided by range tables and map coordinates plotted down to the last meter. For 5.5 hours, the barrage continued, an unbroken rhythm of shell and recoil, smoke and flame. To the German Afrika Korps, it felt as though an entire mountain range had been set ablaze. Behind the spectacle was pure discipline. Gunners worked in silence except for shouted commands. The recoil buffers hissed, shell casings flew, and the guns seemed alive, breathing in mechanical rhythm. They fired not blindly, but with precision, each gun a part of a vast, synchronized machine of destruction. The 25-pounders did not simply bombard. They guided the infantry. Each barrage crept forward, 100 yards at a time, just ahead of the advancing troops. The soldiers trusted that line completely. The shells fell so consistently that men could walk forward behind the explosions, protected by their own artillery's precision. By dawn, the battlefield was a landscape of flame and shattered armor. German and Italian positions were smashed, communication lines cut, and morale crippled. Reports from the front described the effect as mathematical annihilation. For many of those who witnessed it, El Alamein marked the moment when British artillery regained its lost pride. The lessons learned in the trenches of 1916 had been reborn, perfected by engineers, refined by soldiers, and proven in the desert. When the dust settled, one thing was clear. Britain's so-called forgotten gun had just delivered its defining masterpiece. But the story did not end in the desert. The gun's journey, from Africa's dunes to Europe's hedgerows, was only halfway complete. Its greatest challenge was yet to come. By 1943, the 25-pounder had become the undisputed backbone of the British and Commonwealth armies. Wherever British troops went, Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, the gun went with them, its distinctive crack marking every advance. Its reputation spread through the ranks. If you heard the clean, rhythmic firing of a 25-pounder battery, you knew the British were near, and the battle line was holding. In Italy, the gun's versatility shone. From the rocky slopes of Monte Cassino to the mud-choked valleys of the Sangro, it performed tasks no single weapon was ever meant to handle. Counter-battery fire, anti-tank defense, smoke screens, and illumination. The gun crews, often operating within range of German 88s, learned to shoot, pack, move, and fire again in minutes. They called it shoot and scoot, and the 25-pounder was perfect for it. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, its precision had reached near perfection. On the morning of June 6th, as the beaches burned under enemy fire, the 25-pounders of the Royal Artillery were already pounding German positions inland, providing the measured, surgical fire that kept infantry alive. Each battery worked from carefully plotted data compiled weeks earlier, every hedge, road, and farmhouse marked for targeting. Observers from the U.S. Army were stunned. They noted how British artillery could shift its fire by mere degrees and still hit targets invisible to the naked eye. The key lay in the map grid system perfected during the interwar years, a method so precise that a forward observer could radio a 6-digit coordinate and watch, within seconds, a shell land exactly on that spot. In Normandy's maze of fields and villages, where visibility was often measured in yards, such precision was priceless. It meant the difference between pinning down an enemy or destroying them outright. At Villers-Bocage, at Caen, and during the breakout to Falaise, the 25-pounder thundered almost non-stop. Its shells shattered strong points, broke counterattacks, and cleared paths for tanks and infantry alike. The men who fired it often said they could feel their accuracy. They didn't need to see the target. They trusted their instruments, their training, and the gun beneath their hands. By late 1944, the sound of the 25-pounder had become the very voice of British firepower. Not the loudest, not the biggest, but the most precise. And with every shot, it wrote a new line in the history of modern artillery. Victory, when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the war that had begun with desperation ended with mastery. In battle reports across every front, North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, Burma, one weapon appeared again and again in the praise of soldiers and commanders alike: the 25-pounder. It had fired millions of shells during the war, yet its mechanical reliability remained astonishing. Crews said it never quit. In the heat of the desert, the freezing mud of Holland, and the choking humidity of Burma, it performed with the same calm precision. It was the gun that always worked, no matter where it was sent. For Britain, this mattered deeply. In 1939, the Royal Artillery had entered the war under-equipped, uncertain, and reliant on the tools of an earlier age. By 1945, it emerged as one of the most feared and respected artillery forces in the world, thanks in no small part to the 25-pounder and the men who served it. Field Marshal Bernard. Montgomery called it the best field gun in any army during the war. His praise was echoed even by Allied commanders who had watched its fire patterns firsthand. The U.S. Army, studying post-war data, noted how British barrages consistently achieved higher hit probabilities per shell fired than almost any other artillery formation in Europe. The gun's influence stretched far beyond the battlefield. In the Commonwealth, nations that had fought under the British flag, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, all adopted or continued using the 25-pounder. It became the standard symbol of modern British gunnery, the heart of artillery schools from Kingston to Canberra. More than a weapon, it became an education. New generations of gunners trained on its mechanisms, learned its mathematics, and carried its discipline into the Cold War era. Even nations that never fired a shot in anger with it used it for decades afterward as a training piece, a living textbook in precision fire. By the time the British Army began phasing it out in the 1960s and 70s, it had already served in over 30 countries and seen action in conflicts far removed from its birth, from Korea to the jungles of Malaya. But even as new technologies replaced it, its legend endured. The story of a gun born in the trenches of the First World War, reborn to define victory in the Second. After 1945, the world changed, empires faded, new alliances rose, but the 25-pounder remained. In many ways, it became a bridge between two generations of warfare, the last great gun of the old world and the first dependable weapon of the new. In Korea, British and Commonwealth batteries once again brought their 25-pounders into action. On frozen ridgelines and snow-covered valleys, they proved their worth all over again. Despite newer guns arriving in U.S. service, the British weapon held its own, reliable, accurate, and mobile. American officers remarked how the British seemed to paint their barrages, laying fire so perfectly that it could carve patterns across the hills. In Malaya, during the long and grinding counterinsurgency of the 1950s, the 25-pounder performed a quieter duty. It fired not at tank divisions, but at jungle clearings, rebel camps, and mountain slopes, still precise, still steady, its bark echoing through the trees. By then, the gun had become a symbol as much as a tool. Its silhouette appeared on Royal Artillery badges, its sound on every training range across Britain and the Commonwealth. Cadets learned gunnery the same way their fathers and grandfathers had, plotting grids, adjusting elevation, trusting their instruments. For many veterans, it was impossible to separate their memories of war from the sound of its firing. That deep, crisp report, sharp but clean, was as familiar as a heartbeat. In reunion halls and regimental museums, men spoke of it not with nostalgia, but with respect. They remembered how it steadied them when chaos reigned, how its precision felt like order in the middle of madness. It was more than machinery. It was a bond of trust between man and weapon, discipline and survival. Even decades later, in ceremonial displays, the 25-pounder continued to fire salutes, its barrels gleaming, its recoil smooth as ever. To younger soldiers watching, it was a glimpse of where their traditions began. When the last active guns were finally retired, many were preserved in museums, parked quietly on green lawns, or placed at memorials. But to those who knew its story, each stood as something far more profound, a monument to endurance, ingenuity, and the quiet genius of a nation that refused to discard the past, and instead perfected it. In the story of the Second World War, the 25-pounder does not glitter like a Spitfire or thunder like a tank. It does not bear the names of generals or heroes, yet it stands as one of the quietest revolutions in military history. A weapon born from memory, refined by necessity, and perfected by discipline. Its creation was not an act of brilliance in a single moment, but a patient evolution across decades. British engineers, constrained by austerity and politics, looked not to invention, but to continuity, trusting that what had once worked could, with care, be made to work again. They were right. What emerged from that philosophy was more than an artillery piece. It was a bridge, linking the mud of the Somme to the sands of El Alamein, the maps of Flanders to the hedgerows of Normandy. A reminder that progress often hides not in novelty, but in refinement. The 25-pounder became proof that precision is a form of courage. The courage to measure, to calculate, to trust human skill over brute force. Every shell it fired carried not just explosive power, but decades of experience. The lessons of a generation that had seen one world destroyed and refused to see another perish the same way. Even today, when modern warfare is guided by satellites and software, the spirit of the 25-pounder remains. Its logic, accuracy before volume, reliability before glamour, still defines the best artillery doctrines in the world. And for those who once stood behind it, who loaded its shells and felt its recoil in their bones, It remains something deeply human. A reminder that even in the most destructive acts of war, there can exist precision, discipline, and a strange kind of grace. In the end, the 25-pounder was never just a gun. It was a legacy, forged in the ashes of one world war, perfected in the fire of another, and remembered as the moment when Britain's forgotten weapon became its most faithful instrument of victory.